Welcome back to ASMR Lightning Lamp. The subject matter of tonight's video is a subject that I'm quite passionate about. That is automobiles. As you can see before you, there's a model of what's classically known as an American muscle car. It's one of the more obscure muscle cars, the muscle car era, as it is the Buick's muscle car. This is known as a 1967 Buick Gran Sport 400. The body style's historically known as the Skylark, but in 1967, General Motors and Buick decided to launch the GS 400 as its own model. GS stands for Gran Sport. 1967 was the first year for the big block Buick 400 engine. As you can see here, this engine replaced the infamous nailhead big block Buick engine, which was a favorite for racers up through the 50s, late 50s and early 60s. The Buick 400 engine, one of its many assets, was that it was a big block in design, meaning that the engine block was larger than a small block, allowing for a larger displacement. In addition to the fact that this particular engine, although the engine block in volume and mass, well, size anyway, is larger than, let's say, a small block Chevrolet engine, it happens to be lighter than a small block Chevrolet engine, even though it's a big block engine with a higher displacement. This is also one of the key features that Buick had over other products offered by General Motors at the time. One of the rarest pieces of this car, you can see here, kind of tricky to get it, but anyway, you can see here this unusually shaped air cleaner, today commonly referred to as the Star Wars air cleaner, because the design of it looks similar to that of the Millennium Falcon, although interestingly enough, that's not what it was referred to in the 60s, or even most of the 70s, as Star Wars hadn't come out yet. Buick's products were traditionally seen as offerings for older young adults, let's say in their late 20s, early 30s, or even middle-aged adults in their late 30s, early 40s. Muscle cars were the big craze in the 60s. The interesting thing about them is they were relatively affordable. Buick, because it was considered more of a higher-end vehicle, let's say, versus the Oldsmobile, Pontiac, or Chevrolet, it had more amenities than the the other products offered by General Motors in the same class, being that mid-sized car. One of these features is the automatic transmission, which this model car actually has. Of course, it's difficult to see on this video, but I assure you, it has an automatic shifter and only a brake pedal, no clutch. You can also see, by looking underneath, the shape of the transmission pan looks almost like a kidney bean, which is one of the biggest giveaways that this engine is backed up by what's known as the Turbo Hydromatic 400, one of General Motors' automatic transmissions. These particular cars, that being the Gran Sport 400, that came with the 400 transmission in it, backed up by that supported the 400 big block Buick engine, was actually known as the Super Turbine 400. The reason that it had that special designation is because the transmission's torque converter had two different stall speeds, and there was a tiny little switch connected to the carburetor linkage underneath the air cleaner, and there was a secondary switch at the back of the throttle linkage. So at idle, the stall speed in this particular transmission, the stall speed is the RPM at which the converter flashes to being essentially locked. Not quite. Being locked it's a totally different feature, but basically when all the torque that the engine was going to give the transmission was there. The high stall speed's 2,800 RPMs, 2,800 RPMs. At park throttle, meaning as soon as you touch the accelerator, the first switch on the throttle linkage would flip the stall speed down to 1,800 RPMs. So the transmission would receive full engine power once the engine got to 1,800 revolutions per minute. The stall speed stayed at 1,800 RPMs for all part throttle cruising, which allowed for better gas mileage as there was less power loss through the drivetrain, as the engine was essentially sending all of its power through the transmission at any RPM above 1,800 RPMs. And generally speaking, at all speeds driven on the street, the engine will be turning over 1,800 RPMs, especially if the car had the optional performance rear end with 3.90 to 1 gear ratio. The advantage of having a higher stall speed, that of 2,800 at idle, was that as this time frame was characterized by, these cars traditionally came with four-wheel drum brakes, and oftentimes manual brakes, meaning there was no vacuum diaphragm to assist in the brake boosting. So, having the higher stall speed when your foot was off of the accelerator allowed for easier braking, as you were no longer fighting the engine once the RPMs dropped below 2,800 RPM. The other advantage being the second switch on the throttle linkage that's actually attached to the carburetor had three positions. The first 60% of the switch travel was the low stall speed. If the throttle position opened more than 60%, it switched to the high stall speed, which allowed for, at slower speeds or at a dead stop, for the engine to get up to 2,800 RPMs before it applied its power through the transmission. And the way that a gasoline engine works is that it has a torque band and a horsepower band. And most gasoline engines don't really start making torque until they get up over 2,500, 3,000 RPMs. So by allowing the transmission to essentially stall until 2,800 RPMs, that allowed for the engine to get up into its power band so that under heavy acceleration or racing conditions, we were going to receive the maximum power available at the lower RPM. This is especially advantageous for Buick engines, as they are well known for having very good low-end RPM. These cars were perhaps not the fastest cars on the street at the time, but they certainly held their own, and if driven by somebody who knew what they were doing, could hang with any Chevelle GTO or Camaro, even a Corvette maybe, depending on who he's driving. What's interesting too about these vehicles is that you could get the Gran Sport performance package, but not all of the cars came with the bucket seats that are modeled in this particular car. This car also models the classic center console, which also, by the way, indicates that this is indeed the automatic, as the 4-speed version of this car, the 4-speed manual transmission version, or even the 3-speed manual transmission, I believe that was an option on this particular vehicle. It didn't have the full center console if it had the manual transmission. These cars, quite remarkable, and they were on the pricier side of all the General Motors product lineup at the time, because, well, it's Buick. This particular vehicle does feature the power brake booster, which was an option, not standard. It also features power steering, and this one actually features air conditioning, as can be seen not so well again in this particular video, but there is a pulley and an air compressor pump for air conditioning. And another way we can tell is inside the car, right here at the bottom of the dashboard, there's the classic air conditioning vent, circular vent, which was not present if the vehicle did not have factory air conditioning. Now, one other tidbit, should you ever find yourself in the market for purchasing one of these cars in real life, is the fact that, of course, being this is a model, doesn't really display this fact well, but it is indeed a fact that in 1967 only, these vehicles had a fully boxed frame, though they were a hardtop. Traditionally, the fully boxed frame was reserved only for convertible vehicles, and the additional support structure of the frame, being that it was fully boxed in, made up the difference for lack of structural integrity on the vehicle that was the convertible. Now, in 1967, all Gran Sport 400s, regardless of whether or not they were convertible or a hardtop, as this car is, had a fully boxed frame. That's one of the ways that you can tell, if you're looking at one of these cars, if it's an authentic GS 400. I've not really looked too much into why this is the case. I suspect perhaps that it's due to the fact that 1967 was the last year for this classic body design, as in 1968 the vehicle switched to a more fastback, a more rounded rear end. And thus the frame design changed, the wheelbase changed slightly, making these frames for this body style obsolete. So I suspect that perhaps there was a surplus of boxed frames for this particular body style, as the frame for this vehicle is interchangeable with all mid-sized General Motor products of the era, that being the Chevrolet Chevelle, the Oldsmobile Cutlass, the Pontiac GTO Le Mans. And I suspect that the Gran Sport 400 got the box frame because, again, it was the more higher priced option offering of the General Motors lineup in this class. And that's just my theory. I don't know that that's true or not, but we'll go with it. Why not? I really enjoy these cars. This is my favorite era of cars. Sort of. I don't know that I necessarily have a totally favorite era. I enjoy pretty much all vintage of automobiles. I think they're just fascinating. Ever since I was a small child, I've just been totally obsessed with automobiles. I think this particular era, and especially this particular body style, hold a special place in my heart just because as a child, this particular mid-sized General Motors body style was most imprinted on me. I just had very strong feelings towards this particular car. My true dream car, or the car that I have the strongest feelings for, would actually be the Chevelle, not the Buick, not the Gran Sport 400 or the Skylark. But that being said, this is still the 8-body General Motors vehicle, which is also what a Chevelle is. So certainly, I wouldn't poo-poo this particular car. I think they're quite handsome cars. I certainly think you could have a lot of fun with one of these cars. As I said, maybe not the fastest thing on the street, certainly not now, even at the time, but certainly fast enough to have a little fun, and could definitely get yourself in some trouble too. Being that it is the muscle car offering, I believe that most of them came with General Motors Positraction, short for positive traction, meaning that both rear wheels were driven, the power was distributed equally through the rear differential to the rear wheels. The reason for doing this was it allowed for greater traction from a dead stop to launch the vehicle at high speed, to accelerate rapidly. Having both wheels with equal power minimized the wheel slipping and helped ensure that all the power got from the wheels to the ground and accelerated the vehicle forward. Now, because this is a street-driven vehicle, the differential had to be set up as what's known as a limited slip differential, meaning that in certain scenarios, the wheels wouldn't be locked all the time. In fact, with a limited slip, they're never locked all the time. The only time both wheels receive equal power is under high load, because there's a mechanism inside the differential that detects a minimal amount of wheel slipping, and once one of the wheels starts to slip, the differential engages and locks both wheels together. But under normal driving conditions, the differential is open, and this allows for smooth cornering because what happens is, as you're going around a turn, whichever direction you're turning, the outer wheel will be turning faster than the inner wheel. If both wheels were locked continuously without the ability to unlock, what would happen is one of the wheels would be drug, as the wheel speed would not be equal. At the very least, this is an unpleasant experience inside the vehicle, as it gives a choppy sensation as you're turning a corner. It leads to excessive tire wear, as you're essentially dragging one of the tires around you every turn you make. And on a more serious note, it can even lead to breaking an axle, damaging the driveline, the ring and pinion inside the differential. So, of course, car lovers are very grateful that engineers developed the capability to offer a rear end that both can lock both wheels, create equal traction under heavy acceleration going forward, and yet can still unlock going around turns, allowing for much better drivability. Drivability with most vehicles is key, generally speaking. Any street-driven car, you want it to be well-mannered on the street. You want it to drive like any other car that you get into. The fun thing about the classic muscle car is that it did just that. Under normal circumstances, it would drive just like any other car of the time. The thing that was fun about them is when asked to, they really came to life. Had just a wonderful charm, the best of both worlds, or as much as it could be at the time. The interesting thing about the muscle car era is how was a muscle car turned a muscle car. The evolution of the muscle car actually comes through the Pontiac GTO and a man who is somewhat infamous. Some of you may have heard of him, a man named John DeLorean. The same man who developed the DeLorean motor car that was featured in all of the Back to the Future movies. In the early 60s, he actually worked for General Motors and was the head of the Pontiac Motor Division. At the time, it was corporate policy that what was characterized as the big block engine was not to go into any of the mid-sized cars. The big block engine was reserved for the full-sized cars because full-sized cars garnered a higher premium than did the mid-sized cars. And the businessmen at General Motors thought it foolhardy to put a big block engine into the mid-sized car. I think it's comical to a lot of people that a car this size, not the model size, the life-size car, is actually considered a mid-sized car, as it dwarfs most passenger cars that are in production today in size. So what Mr. DeLorean did is he got together with some of his partners in crime, so to speak. Not really in crime. He had partners in crime later on in life, but not at Pontiac necessarily. But they concocted a plan and executed it where they took the Pontiac Le Mans, which was the Pontiac mid-sized car at the time, and put a special offering package in it, putting the big block engine into the Pontiac Le Mans. This turned out to be a big hit, and so any mid-sized car with the big block engine is considered a true American muscle car, and that's where the term comes from. Now, there are lots of fast cars on the street, lots of hot rods, custom cars, big engines, big blowers, nitrous, whatever variety of power additions. but it's not a true muscle car unless it was a mid-sized car featuring a big black engine from the factory. And that's a little background on the American muscle car. That being said, I hope you enjoyed tonight's video with the ASMR lightning lamp. And of course, a little tutorial on one of my very near and dear favorite topics, the automobile. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.